Good evening and welcome to the Feynman Factor. This evening I'm going to be talking to Jondo Massaero again. And just by way of introduction, he's an initial Alexander Technique teacher in Montpellier, France. And I am an Alexander Technique and movement education teacher here in Melbourne, Australia. And I've been learning and exploring work that John Doe has introduced me to for the past couple of years now. And there's always more to explore, and he's always learning. So it's my pleasure again to have you on this podcast. Welcome, John Doe.
Welcome, Mastani. Hi.
Hi. So this evening we're going to talk about something that it's best to just introduce it as what are appropriate movements. And my understanding of the word appropriate, and you can call me on this, John Doe, is that they're the most efficient ones for our functioning. Is that how you approach it? Is that a good how do you call it, a diagnosis of the word appropriate?
Yes, it's a correct diagnosis. And also what we can say is that there are new movements that Alexander would say discovered that can replace the bad movements that we are seen doing when we are performing an act, like standing, sitting, any act you can think about. For example, Alexander is well known to have said that I'm only interested in movements. He said that when he was quite old, in fact. And he said, for example, when you're lifting an arm. So first of all, you have to understand that lifting an arm or any other movement of the limbs will affect the geometry of the structure, and of course, its balance in space. So it's very clear at the end of his life, Alexander explains in his last book that we are dealing with postural responses. That even when you take a cup of coffee, in fact, to generate the stability that will allow the movement of the arm to lift, all the muscles of the body have to, all the structure of the body have to interact in order for you, of course, to be successful in drinking your tea, but also in keeping you balanced. And we will see that very often we are able to drink our tea, but at the expense of the postural system, which in fact, in this case, involves incorrect movements. Alexander sometimes used the word bad movements.
So let me just stop you there. So just something that about the one of the very things that got me interested in Alexander Technique was the fact that he uses images to say stories, just like he did now. And so the more I've learned, now I realize that if, let's say, someone from a scientific or research community might be listening to this, they might say, well, we're talking about a healthy individual, neurologically healthy individual drinking that cup of tea. We're talking about someone who is has the properties of the brain that are associated with being able to balance. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And also the way I teach, we are also speaking of a person that is capable of understanding orders, verbal orders, so that the person is able to, in fact, transform his own coordination using verbal instructions. And that is the basis of the Alexander Technique. So yes, we are not talking about at the moment of trying to help an individual or a baby that has an pathological coordination and cannot stand or cannot walk. This is a different, it should be a different interview for that. And it would be tentative. It would not be what I know, because for me, it's only research. I like working with children with deficit of coordination, and most of the time they have autism, so they don't speak. So it's a very different kind of idea. Yes, we are talking about an able-bodied and able mentally also a person that is only able to understand language, English language. I work with people on Skype, and of course we have to discuss movements. We have to discuss the space in which the movements are happening. We have to discuss the time in which the movements are happening. So, of course, that is only possible if the person is able to understand my language. Otherwise, I cannot help the person to learn a new way of organizing different movements. Yeah? So that helps to circumscribe what it is we're talking about.
Yeah.
Very often, you will find that people more or less know that what Alexander calls bad movements occur in their way of doing things. Yes. They don't know how to solve it. Very often, I've seen sometimes people say, well, I know that my shoulder blades is sticking out. And so, yes, do you know that? Say, what are you doing about it? What is your system for dealing with it? If you know that this is incorrect, and you will see, yes, it is incorrect. Most often, people try yoga, try exercise, try also physiotherapy or any type of intervention coming from outside, somebody doing something to them. So it doesn't really work unless, as Alexander discovered, the person herself decided to try and look into, well, you would say study, how these movements are generated and how the person can somehow change. I only deal with people that want to, that understand that they are part of the problem. It's their decision to do the movements. It's not a conscious decision most of the time. It's a decision that is based on what they feel. They have a feeling that in order to do something, for example, to sit down, they have to do a few movements. Yes? What are these movements they are doing? They are not very clear about it. You know, when you say, what are you doing with your knees when you sit? Well, they would answer, well, like most people, I bend. Yes, but how do you bend them? So that surprise is there are two different ways to bend the knees. Yes, there are two different ways to bend the knees, for example, you see. But the person has never imagined that it was possible to change either the timing or how the movement geometrically would happen. Suddenly, if you ask them to direct their attention to the way the joint is working and the way we want it to work, somehow they say, but it's impossible. What you're asking me, I've never done it. It's not like that. And nobody does it, by the way. Say, well, nobody that hasn't been trained. Yes, it's impossible, but could you try?
Yeah.
So this is all the basis of the teaching is experiments. So
today it's very interesting.
It's
very interesting before you go on, and I'm very excited because you've got the whole thing prepared, and we might turn this into two segments if we go over time. But I got a book of Leonardo da Vinci's anatomical drawings, and this book has his annotations translated. And some of the annotations say these are preparations for what he was going to do. And he was going to start from gesture, emotions, and all that he had observed about the human condition, all into the bones, and what movements create flexion and extension and rotation and supination and plantar flexion of the ankles. And it's just quite amazing what he actually wanted to do. But there's one of the side note that he says, and please deal with what you have and treat it with a lot of respect, because I've seen so many times the man's body has been just, it's been hit by disease or some ailment. So if you understand the body, then treat it with respect. So it's kind of like, well, who cares if there's two different ways of bending the knees? Well, actually, it's about preserving our body in for time. So I think when the picture becomes clear like that, and one of the other things that he said is that when you bring the person's attention to the fact that they have control, oh well, the game changes. And a fantastic example in my own experience with Alexander work is that I walked into a room over a 3-hour period. There were 70 students who were taking an elective in Alexander technique at Melbourne University Music School. And I was tutoring for one of my colleagues, and they were used to feeling it. They were used to my colleague using the hands, and it was that experience when I used to use the hands, and the person would say, can I just take you around with me? That feels so good. And I'm going like, no, but we're supposed to become curious about something. You're falling asleep.
Yeah.
And so this was the beginning when you introduced me to the anatomical action coding system and the time and the geometry and the defining space. And as soon as I started working with the students, it was like they just had a huge cup of coffee and a big chocolate cake. And it was this bolt of energy in them because someone had asked them a question. And the question went like, do you know that you have control? And here it is. And it's actually a game that you can play. And it was amazing. It was just like, wow, I'm not going back. I'm not going back. It was fantastic, So yeah, so I had to share that because I think learning something can be so daunting for adults. That's just like a fact. And when we have a rationale that comes from many different voices, like Da Vinci, who was just a human being, but he was also really interested in engineering as well as having a amazing ability at memorizing gesture and capturing it. And when we hear it about from our doctor that we should take care of our body, but then to learn something along the lines of initial Alexander technique, yeah, it's like almost its own gift, So yeah, it's wonderful. Anyway, digressing. Sorry, John Doe.
It's okay. Well, now I need to go to start defining, because it's very, very important that people understand that, well, there are words like control, there are words like guidance, and very often we are not very clear about what they mean. They can mean very many things. I'm not saying that people don't know what they mean. I mean that their meaning may be very different from the meaning Alexander used and the meaning we are using. So it's very important when we start discussing experiments that people can make experiments with their own movements. It's important to define things. And there is a slight problem, is that Alexander was not a scientist himself. And so his relationship with words was rather difficult. So sometimes, yes, you have to understand that his books cannot be read or studied like scientific books. You have to invest a lot of time and a lot of cross referencing to make sure that you really know what he means when he uses words. But sometimes, as you will see, I've prepared a sentence for you. Sometimes the words are very simple, but yet they may hide problems. So today I'm going to show you images and sentences so that we can organize the discourse, and so that people can relate what we say with something more factual, more concrete. Okay, so that's a new thing. I'm going to try and share screen. Let's see if it works. I cannot see it from my side, so you have to tell me if you see a sentence.
Perfect.
Okay, so Alexander is talking about a very simple act, which we call standing. It's going from sit to stand. That's where we are. That's the young Alexander talking. It's his first book. This passage was present in the first edition of Man's Supreme Inheritance. That's the title of the book, and that is what he says. If you care to experiment on a friend in the act of rising, so he's talking about rising from a chair, yeah, you will observe that in the movement, as performed by an imperfectly coordinated person, the same bad movements occur, tending to stiffen the neck, to arch the spine unduly, to shorten the body, and to protrude the abdominal wall. You can find this sentence in Man's Supreme Inheritance, and I've set the page. It's page 171. I will leave the sentence on board for a second because I've made a few adjustments, as you have seen. I have placed some colors of highlights in this sentence because there are a few things that we must discuss before starting to go further. The first is that Alexander is talking about rising from a chair. It's a postural movement. You understand that it involves your balance. Is suddenly in an experiment, someone like me, for example, asks you not to throw, for example, your arms forward to balance yourself. Then suddenly you discover that your habitual movements to stand, well, take into account the fact that you're going from the safety of the chair to a very different organization where all the weight has to be on the floor, on the feet. And if it's not, it means that you're falling. And most people don't like falling. So that's what we call a postural response. At the same time, you're, well, doing an act. So what is very important to see in this sentence is that in the same wording, Alexander used the same word, which is movement, to describe two completely different things. And this can lead to all sorts of misunderstanding. So we have this action of going from the chair to full standing. Yes. And Alexander is saying that you will observe something when you look at a person doing that action. And he says what you will observe, and he says the same bad movement occur. There are movements inside a large movement. So you can imagine how much confusion this can, because you never know from there, what is he talking about? Is he talking about the component movements of the global action, or is he talking simply of a global action? You know, and this is very important because in the Alexander technique, we have this idea that people, as you say, have control. I would not use the same words that you did, have a potential guidance that is either subconscious, they guide the movements of the different parts according to what they feel. That's what we call subconscious guidance. Or they have what Alexander invents, it's called it conscious guidance. So what is conscious guidance? Conscious guidance, according to Alexander, is the capacity to make decisions, to allow movement to happen, and to make decision to refuse to give consent to some movements. Of course, you will understand quickly that you will refuse to give your consent to bad movements. And you will go and give consent to the new movements that should happen. Okay, so this is too complex.
So these are the sub movements.
Yes.
This is in reference to the sub movements within the global action of rising from a chair.
That's correct. So I will go on to define this so that you get an idea. But first of all, what is very important is to not reproduce the same error and separate very clearly what we are talking about. Are we talking of global action, or are we talking of what you call sub-movements? Okay, so to resolve this problem, when I translated, I thought that it was better to give two different names. So when I will call the attention of the people to what is a global action, so standing, for example, you have to have the feet, the knees, the hips, the whole torso, the neck and head, and even the arm involved in it. So this is absolutely not a component. It's a global action. So I will call it a gesture. The reason why it's called a gesture, well, people might ask themselves the question, say, well, it's not expressive. I am not expressing anything when I rise from a chair. I'm just rising from a chair. Well, you have to remember that Alexander was an actor. And on stage, your global actions are not just actions. They are also means to convey to the public an idea about what you have inside yourself, the kind of emotion, the kind of anima is moving you. It's not you, of course, because you are, well, impersonating a character. But there is this idea of making something observable by others. And it's very important to use that word because there are two different movements. I mean, inside the gesture is that there is the one you think you're doing, the one you feel. You say, I'm doing this, and so you think that everybody is seeing what you're doing. Well, in fact, they do, but they do see something quite different. They have an objective representation, while you have a subjective representation. Yeah. Well, nowadays, we are very lucky because with videos, for example, you can suddenly start to see yourself as other people see you. And there is a very well-known passage in Alexander about the man who couldn't see himself as others saw him. And Alexander places a great emphasis on objectivity, concrete things, okay? So we have, instead of saying, you will observe that in the movement as performed by the imperfectly coordinated person, I would say, you will observe that in the gesture as performed by the imperfectly coordinated person, the same bad movements occur. And so that I will keep the second word, movements. So what are we talking about when I say I am considering the movement of one part of the torso? Okay, so you have to understand there that we are talking of the anatomical structure. We are talking about, for the moment, mainly the levers, the bones. It's the bones that are, in fact, allowing movements due to the fact that they are jointed. They are articulated. Yes? So Alexander, for example, is talking about arching the spine unduly. Okay. Arching the spine unduly is part of a gesture and is created by a series of bad movements. Okay, so when you say, okay, bad movements, good movements, what are we talking about? Well, I will show you a picture. It's quite an interesting picture. I took the picture from a film. It's a reunion of students of the first training course.
Yep.
According to the film, it took place in 1932. I am not at all convinced that the date is correct, but it can be. The first training course started in 1931. So we are supposed to see a picture of a gentleman helping a lady to rise from a chair. Yes. And he's just a student. He's got 1 year of study. After 1 year of study, he's allowed to touch people and to make them move. That surprised me, you know, because you laugh because you know what it is. We both had a training course in a stat training course where it was, well, the myth is that the students were not allowed to put hands on people before the 3rd year. So there is something strange. But here, there is also a gesture. We see that the gentleman has bent he has leaned forward with his torso in order to reach for the rib cage of the lady that is sitting on the chair. Okay.
Yeah.
But his gesture does not correspond with the sentence I've had you read just before. There is no arching of the back. I've set a ruler on his back in the Delsart fashion to show that, in fact, this man has, in fact, given consent to different movements of the parts of the torso so that they look like what we are seeing at the moment. And it's absolutely clear that gentleman is lengthening his back. So for the moment, he's lengthening, as we can see, well, 2/3 of his back. The lower back and the middle back are lengthening, while the upper back is projected forward so that the head can be forward and up relative to the ruler. It's very clear there is an attitude that is absolutely not habitual.
Yes.
You would be surprised. Most people cannot give consent to that type of movements. And they cannot suppress giving consent to the movement that make them feel good. So this image is not like a one chance. No. It's taken from the film. We see the gentleman from standing to bending very low, doing this gesture, and also I will show you another one. But this time it's a different person, and somehow there is a resemblance. It's the male, now it's a female, okay, but their anatomical structure apparently is guided intentionally. It's
and
not
the sub movements from that sentence that we were looking at before. Those are all related. They form like the stiffening of the neck and the protruding of the abdomen are related to each other. So this person has learned to give certain orders and to say no to certain other things that they might be happening to bring about a non-habitual set of movements that change the global movement.
Yes, that's correct. So for the moment, we can say that there is intentionality. It's absolutely clear that the person has anticipated the movement and has decided to consciously guide the movements of the different parts. There are directions of movements. It's absolutely clear. Yeah, that's how I view these pictures. They are still here, but you can all go and find the film. It's on YouTube. It's easy to find. If you want to know, you can just send me an email. I will give you the reference. It's very simple. So there is something here, and we see a pattern. We see that these people are not trying to adjust themselves according to what they feel. There is a model. There is a model, and I can say that because when you look at pictures of Alexander working, you see the same model. There is here evidence that people are able, after 1 year of training, to Maybe less, yes, but for the moment, that's the date I have is 1932. They started, I'm sure, in September 1931. So at least they have 1 year of training. After 1 year of training, they're able to perform a series of movements which lengthen their torso and bring their head forward and up.
They started in September 31.
Yeah.
And so to me, it looks like they're wearing maybe spring clothing. So I reckon that it's less than 1 year.
Yeah. Well, if the dates are correct, for the moment, the time sequence is not very clear, but at least there is something clear in the film, is that these people are able to direct their shape. So my question was, I did a 3-year training course in the Alexander Technique, in a STAT training course. And at the end of my training, I used videos to perform different procedures, and I watched myself, and I was nowhere near that. You see, I was trained in the modern Alexander technique, and in the modern Alexander technique, there are no position. There is a very famous sentence from which this is taken. It says there are no correct position. Okay? And in my school, it was clear that there was no correct position. We were not trained to analyze a gesture in movements. We were not trained to give consent to certain movements and inhibit other movements. We were into a myth that if you organize the neck to be free, then the head will go forward and up, and then the back will lengthen and widen. It was very, very difficult to inquire into this guidance. To say, what do you mean by neck free? Alexander is very clear that you should never try to have the neck free. So if you started to go with this, I can tell you that your 3 years would not be very nice, because teachers could not answer. They could not answer. Even head forward and up doesn't have a definition. It doesn't. For most people, it's a rotation of the head relative to the top of the neck. Well, if you look at all the pictures I have produced, you will see that, well, it's quite easy to have another idea of a definition of head, neck free, head forward and up, because there is a clear relativity between the parts. And it's absolutely clear that in all these students and in Alexander, what we see is that the head is very far forward from the back. So
I mean, the way I like to think about what you just said regarding the relationship of things is that if you have a rather dynamic system, and like a violin, the person who's making the violin can't just look at one part.
Yeah,
it's an interrelation that is able to create the resonance that's required. And it's really funny because Da Vinci, when he's talking about the foot and the angles of weight bearing, he actually goes on and he talks about the interior of the ankle, but then he switches his game and he talks about the exterior of the ankle. That's just because that's he talks about the big toe as being very important, and the sesamoid bone being there, and the ligament underneath. And then he doesn't carry that through, and he talks about the exterior of the ankle joint as being the weight bearing, which doesn't make sense.
No.
So, but that was, in the 1500s. So in a way, the way that our training in modern Alexander techniques spanned out doesn't have to stay static. We can come up with better evidence and better reasoning and come up with something that is more teachable, more economic, and more functional, actually, than saying, let the neck be free.
Yeah.
Just because it's there doesn't mean it's correct.
So we have evidence. There is evidence that Alexander was able at one point to transmit with his hands a certain organization. But we have also other evidences, is that this skill was his. And other teachers, or the first generation teachers, were not able to transmit the correct coordination, and the pupils were not able to decipher what is the correct organization of the parts. When Alexander defined primary control, he's defining a relativity between the head, neck, and torso. But here, when we look at the bad movements which occurs, the bad movements are all in the torso. The torso is an articulated system, and you will see that it's possible to bend forward. Well, maybe not that low, because that's extreme. It's just showing that it's possible to continue the movement of flexion right from the standing position to the squatting position. Well, there is evidence. But when you look at another picture now, I've set a picture where on the left you have Alexander himself, yes, and he's in also spring clothing. So it's very clear that his organization of the back is the same as the one we've seen before. So the same pattern occurs again, yes. But I've taken a picture from a video of a first generation teacher who was explaining the new craze, which was lying people on a table. Why do I say it's a craze? Well, it's a craze because it's the first procedures that the modern Alexander technique puts forward. You know, it's what people must do to work with themselves, which it is very, very strange because the person is lying on a flat surface. There is no organization of movements. You cannot give consent. You can learn to give consent to a movement of a part relatively to another part when you're lying flat on a table. But that's not the subject. The subject is that you will see here that it's quite easy to, in fact, observe the relativity of the parts. It's easy because we have the sacrum bone, which is very, very easy to find, and the spinous process of the lumbar region. It forms a line. So I draw a line. It's the green line on the right side. Yes. Yep. And then if you follow that line, well, in Alexander, you get to what he called the hump. And the hump is that the fact that the upper torso is directed to go forward. Yeah. Marjorie Barlow explains in her last book that in the first training course, Alexander was always repeating two instructions of movements. One was back, and the other one was the upper torso comes forward. Well, when you hear these instructions and you look at Alexander, well, you think, yes, he's pretty good at giving consent to these movements, yes? And you can see also that he's pretty good at giving consent to having the upper torso come forward without going down. Because many people can have the upper torso come forward and the back go back. But when they do so, you will notice the same bad movement. The person will lower the upper torso and, in fact, compress the two cavities that we call the torso, the thoracic and abdominal cavity.
So where the lungs are.
Yes, where your lungs are. So we see that Alexander has a plan, he has a model, and so he guides according to that model. And what we are doing when looking at the picture is something I call the control. We are controlling according to the model to see if the person has been able to direct the movements we want to see and to inhibit giving consent or refuse to give consent to the movement we don't want to see. So what don't we want to see? We don't want to see a lordosis. If you look at the lumbar curve in Alexander and the lumbar curve in the first generation teacher, there is something strange. It's absolutely clear that the movement of the lower torso, the pelvis, is forward, and that the movement of the middle torso is back.
In the first generation teacher.
Yes, because that's a first generation teacher I'm showing here. So we see that there is a new understanding, the new Alexander technique. And the new Alexander technique has, in fact, separated itself from this idea of means whereby, of directing movements in and making decisions. Alexander is very clear. He comes back all the time to this idea. You're not making decisions. You're doing according to what you feel. Yeah. Well, he's in part responsible for that, because he never taught people to just analyze the movement and command this movement and to see whether the result, the gesture, was according to the plan or not. He was the one to teach these people. These people, of course, they wanted for themselves to learn how to put their hands on people. They wanted to do what Alexander was doing. They wanted to imitate. But he was the one. Why? I can't. Sometimes it's very, very difficult to knowing what Alexander knew, knowing what he writes, How could he fall into such a, well, when you see the images,
Yeah.
suddenly it makes sense. So we
So
have
I mean,
here.
I have another time we can do another conversation about some theories about why,
Yeah.
and also the state of the world and the state of Europe, and what I like to refer to as the ugly cult of somatics that
Oh yeah.
was what was rising out of anyway. So yeah, let's keep going, but
I
we can
want
have
to,
another
yeah,
conversation
I
about
wanted
why.
to make a bit clearer what we are talking about. What are these sub movements? Yes.
Yeah.
So I said they are movements of the anatomical structure. So it's evident for everybody that the torso is articulated. Okay, there is a spine in it, and that spine is a joint. It's a gigantic joint. Okay, so I have taken Alexander to his word. So Alexander is saying that when the person is leaning forward or bending, that person displays the same series of bad movements. Well, you will see it's a little bit more complex than this, but for the moment, I've taken an X-ray of a standing person, and that standing person, of course, is showing a lordosis. The lordosis is what Alexander refers to as the shortening of the back and the protrusion of the abdomen. So he uses very different, in his books, you have protrusion of the abdomen, protrusion of the ribs. Protrusion is always referring to that organization. So
When
what do we
something is
see here?
shortened.
Well, we see a series of movements. Well, it's a still picture, but we can imagine which movement have been, in fact, performed in order for that lordosis to happen. So when you look at an X-ray like this, there is a bad habit that is very, very important to look and to deconstruct. Is that most people think that this is how the person is. No, this is just the result of the movement she's just made. So maybe these are habitual movements. Maybe the person
Fantastic.
is standing like this, okay? But when that same person will be sitting, you will know that in 2 seconds, she will be in a slump position. If you were able to X-ray the slump position, you would notice that the angle of the spine has been reversed. Meaning that when the person is standing, a gesture, habitual gesture, according to what she feels as okay, that's her way of standing. Well, you will see this lordotic gesture. Well, when the person wants to rest and nobody's looking, the person will really slump, which means that the pelvis will be completely pushed backwards, yes, and the upper torso will be completely pushed forward, as if you had bad back and upper torso come forward. But no, not as if, because the person will do that all the time while shortening the stature. So the person knows the two extremes. You have one extreme of bending, which is bending forward, which is lordosis. And when you have another extreme, and the person is able to do it too. So we are not looking at something fixed. We are not looking
at. So I mean, most likely they're being at the moment that's taken. They're responding to the instructions. Take a deep breath. Most likely, it's possible. Yes,
no, it's more than possible, because what happens is that there are procedures in when you take X-rays, and so when people are X-rayed for a very short period of time, if you want to see inside the thoracic rib cage, you need to have the person have the lung full. So most of the time you can assess that the person is in fact expanding the torso as she knows how to do it. You have to understand that expanding the torso is, well, another gesture. You need a movement of expansion. Yes, you need to give consent to certain movement and to inhibit giving consent to other movements. You need to have directions. Most of the time people don't. Their direction are just subconscious. Either they are the direction they have, learned by themselves, by, imitating their parents, or they have been manipulated by touch teachers. There are somatic teachers that by having their hands on them will somehow help them to create a new sensory representation of what should be good. So all this is in fact mediated by what the person is feeling. But you will understand that if a person is able to do the extreme of two movement and not the medial, the medial way, it's very interesting to say that what we are teaching people is just to learn, not to go too far one way or not too far the other way. We are teaching movements. We are not teaching posture. So in this idea of there is no correct position, this is absolutely right. But Alexander adds the last part of the sentence is fundamental. He says, but there is correct coordination.
Yes.
So when you talk about coordination, very often
this is when he's talking about the acrobat.
Yes.
It is, yes.
Correct coordination is correct coordination of movements. When you've seen is the teacher is trained the first series of picture, not the picture of Marjorie Barlow that is arching her back in standing, but the picture arching her back in bending. Sorry, we see that they have a coordination of the movements, and this coordination is conscious. It's not according to what they feel.
Can I just stop you for a second? Because something crystallized is that the idea of there are no correct positions, but there are correct movements and coordinations of movements.
Yeah.
It really makes sense if we are not also, going back to the 3-year training model, being taught to release something.
Oh yeah, that's a
using our mind. So that's when you get to have 3 years, which is you're putting one contradiction upon another one, and so almost putting the richness of that phrase, there are no correct positions, there are correct movements and coordinations of movements. When we know that we can make movements, then it's a 6-month training, if that.
Well, yeah, it's not a 6-month training because what will happen is that, of course, what is it for? Why do you train people? So you train people
what
not.
I'm saying, Jean?
Yeah, you train people to decide in a very, very new way and organize their decision. What is new in the decision is that there is not one decision at a time. But these movements have to be coordinated together. So the person has to know exactly when she starts and when she stops. And so, yes, but I will go your way. I will start thinking about this release system that people are talking about. And this is central, I think, to the understanding of the difference between the initial Alexander I am teaching and the modern Alexander technique that you find all over the world. It's not only that I'm not touching people, that I'm teaching people to experiment with decision of movements. It's more than that. It's that there is a very different understanding of the coordination of the anatomical structure. So very slowly. First of all, when you look at an X-ray like this, there are movements. You can see that there are at least 3 movements. I've put 4 arrows, but at least 3 are necessary. You have to have the middle torso go forward, the upper torso come back, and the lower torso go really far back. That's the way to bend a structure. You bend a structure with 3 movements, okay? I have added a movement because there is the pelvis is attached to the sacrum. It's now called the pelvic vertebrae because it's really like a vertebrae. It's like a large vertebrae that is, in fact, when you pull the middle thorax forward to protrude the abdomen, what happens is that not only is there a translation movement, a movement backward of the lower pelvis, but there is a rotation. And you will find that suddenly the distance between the antero-superior iliac crest, which I have pointed on the design with a little round red dot, this red dot is going down, forward and down, yes, and so toward the knee, so that all the muscles and systems that are between the pelvis at the front and the knee are getting shorter. Very often when people are looking at this, they think that there is too much activity in the muscles of the front of the thigh, and that is pulling the pelvis forward. I am showing here that there is nothing of the sort.
It's actually the reverse.
The reverse, the central system and the most potent muscles or systems that are acting are in the torso. If you want to place your hands on the thigh to release something, you're confusing a cause and a consequence. You have to help the person organize the different movements of the different parts of the torso so that the back goes back, so that the upper torso comes forward. And in that case, what will happen is that the pelvis will rotate backward. When we say the back goes back, it has a concrete signification.
Yes. It's very easy to visualize. I'm only just pausing briefly that what you're describing now, it's very easy to actually learn to put into action. Yeah. I mean, we're going really fast, but it's actually, with a few lessons, it's actually very easy to make the movement of back going back.
Yeah, but that is because we are not dealing with what it feels like.
Exactly.
Because we are dealing in the mind, we are dealing of people understanding systems. Alexander is always talking about mechanism, the mechanism of the torso. So yes, we need to teach people that it is a mechanism, that they have the power of guidance over the movements of the different parts. Well, at first, of course, when they try, they will find how awful it feels to suddenly organize the movement in a conscious way. So they will discover that feeling good is not part of the system at all. We are not there to make people feel good. We are not somatic teachers. We are mind teachers. That's very different. And the more you make somebody feel, the more the person will direct their attention on feelings. It's not what we want. We want the person to direct our attention on decisions. Decisions are not feelings. They cannot be. So the whole idea of hastening the learning of the technique because you're putting hands on people, I think is misconstrued. No, you know how fast it is to suddenly create the coordination of the different movements of the torso so that the head can go forward and up. You know that. Yeah. But most people, they have no idea about it. So it's very telling that a simple system can be made completely mystic by, in fact, dealing with the result feeling that one body would have. If somebody was clever enough to organize the torso of the person with his own hands, that's what Alexander has done. He was never a good teacher, a good mind teacher. The theory set in his books. We are very grateful for him for that. But when it comes to really teaching people, what a waste. What a waste of time. It's amazing. So there is something else we need to talk about. It's a release.
Before you go there, I have to say something. Yeah. What you said about feeling and mind teachers, there's a really rich and beautiful paradox in taking the time to learn to make concrete movements that create that lead to efficient global movements time and time again. And for me, it's like actually your mind is also able to make creative decisions in a much more fluid way. So there's like a fantastic byproduct to not going by feeling. For example, if someone wants to write music, if they go by their feeling, they might just never take the pencil out because they feel tired or they feel like they're not good enough. But if you actually say, well, what drives me, or what it is that I want to express, what gesture it is, then this is a fantastic creative tool, not to rely on habitual feeling. So and it reminds me of some of my favorite compositions have been written extremely quickly.
Yeah.
But it's only because that person has spent daily time, unraveling the masterworks. So they're always building their mind. So it's a fantastic thing. So I think because of our modern language, when we say, "Oh, I want to feel good," that has such a ring to it that when you put it forward in your language, I just want to say that it actually gives a certain type of real empowerment to not go by feeling.
Yes.
I hope that makes it more of a universal language that we can societally kind of relate to, if that makes sense.
We are talking about two different things. There is the feeling, which is the result of a situation and conditions, and there is initiative. Initiative is very different. Initiative is what I want to do. It's not because I feel this or because I feel that. I have a decision to make, and if I learn to, in fact, coordinate decisions, because it's what it is about. It's a cognitive system that we are working with, and we discover that we can learn to, in fact, orientate our decision. It's the executive functions that is fundamental. It's not the result. The result is not very important. The feeling, we don't really care. What is important here is that somehow people suddenly can experiment by themselves without a teacher, a knowing teacher. For example, I am not giving to the people a form. They should be able to represent on the screen. I'm just asking them questions. I say, when you sit, for example, I see that you are protruding the lower torso forward. Did you notice? So the person most of the time doesn't. So it's very easy because we have video recording when we work together, and I can say, well, look, at 12 minutes 20, it's very, very marked. It's very easy to see. Do you see it? And the person will say, oh, yes, it's ugly. No, it's not ugly. It's very interesting. We can invest in that movement. Because investing means that you give. You have to give something. You have to withstand watching yourself doing something you thought you were not doing. For example, when I saw Marjorie Barlow is bending in this film 19 times. She bends 19 times, and 19 times you can see that she's not performing the lengthening of the torso that Alexander.
I've seen the movie. I would like to see it again. Just to look for it.
It's very interesting to see it. And so she's not aware. It's not her fault. How come nobody told her? How come her husband was a teacher? Alexander was was a part of of her family. Why nobody told her? Why is it? It's so you have to invest. But when you invest in that movement, you see. So the next question is, do you think it's humanly possible not to do that movement when you do the gesture? And the person say, no, I don't know. I don't think so. Well, then you can ask the question, have you experimented? Well, no, the person has not experimented. Well, you cannot say for the moment if you can or cannot. You need to experiment. So let's make the experiment very clear. You're going to bend. As you're bending, you're going to decide that you're going to move the pelvis in the other direction. Do you understand what I mean? So that the little protuberance I've shown you on the X-ray, that bone, we want that bone to go away from the knee. Do you understand that? rotation, that when the rotation is happening, the pelvis is going to go back and upward relative to the knee. Yes.
Yeah.
What is going to be the result on the muscle? Is it going to slacken the muscle or extend them? Well, the person will reason and think, oh yeah, it will extend the muscle. And I say, what do you think you're going to feel if you change the movement like this? If it was possible and you were able to do it. Let's go to see what would happen. You would feel nice, or would it be tension? Well, it would be tension. Yes, more than you think. Expect to feel very wrong. Because if you don't expect to feel very wrong, you're still guided by what you feel as correct, you will not extend. You will shorten again, as you always do. Could you take that? And now let's make an experiment. When you are ready, you start, you count 1, 2, 3. When you stop, and you stop at 3 and you count at 1. Okay. Then the person says, okay. And then the person says, oh, it was rubbish again, wasn't it? I say, why do you say so? Because I really tried, but it was horrible. Okay. Watch the video now. And the person watches the video and thinks, and she can see that the back has extended, that the shortening and the protruding of the ribs has diminished by half. Say, wow, how could I feel so bad when I'm now, in fact, looking a little bit like the student of Alexander? Well, I say, well, it's very simple. It's because you didn't allow yourself to feel worse. If you had been able to feel worse than this, you would have been the lengthening back exactly like Alexander, and I suspect that your head would have been even more forward. So yes, it's just a question of. And she say, well, can I experiment again? I say, yes, that's the idea. I am just here to help you experiment. So we have a little problem. It's very, very simple. We need to deal with this question of release and relation between release and movements. And there is a very, very interesting sentence written by Alexander where he's talking about relaxation. So, of course, he's against relaxation. So people will say, well, release is not relaxation. Well, fine, it's not. But it's not what I want to point to. What I want to point to is the fact that Alexander is adding more information about what is the correct organization. But we've been at it for nearly 1 hour and 15 minutes. So this is quite long for people to withstand. So maybe we need to postpone and do another interview so that we can finish that. Because what is happening is that Alexander is saying that there is relaxation. There is what he calls real relaxation. And real relaxation is due tension in the parts that must be tense. And it's also relaxation of the parts that are due to be relaxed. This has to be explained. I want to produce the explanation so that people understand what Alexander is saying and what we're working about. What is the idea? What are the...
Well, if you have time, we can keep going and we'll record, and maybe I'll divide the video at this point.
If you want.